This video is an overview of the university rankings landscape, where they're published, where they reach, and some of the implications of each of these rankings. The ranking landscape is very well established and crowded. There are a lot of rankings in this space. Rankings have existed for a long time, and by some accounts, more than 100 years. These are some of the more popular current rankings, especially the Times Higher Education rankings, the academic ranking of world universities, and the QS World University rankings. A very popular business model in the rankings and publishing space is for publishers to collect a broad data set and publish a comprehensive ranking, and then to slice it up into many smaller rankings that they can then sell as separate products. In this example, the Financial Times ranks business schools and then segments that data out into separate rankings of different types. MBA programs, separate rankings based on geography, separate rankings based on specialty degree programs as well, like the Masters in Management and Masters in Finance that you see here. This is a very common strategy, and I'll show you another example on the next slide. Here we see the QS World University rankings. In this example, QS segments their data from these World University rankings into subsets also. This includes a regional focus on the BRICS countries, which you can see here. It's not the only geographic segment that they do. And separate subject rankings with examples ranging from geography and business and management to global executive MBA to classics and ancient history. Again, these aren't the only subject-focused rankings that QS produces, but they do represent the breadth and the proliferation of specialty rankings that are available for students and consumers of this information. Speaking of consumers of information, consumers of rankings, one of the biggest biggest users of university rankings is actually the university and higher education community itself. It is common for university officials to complain about rankings because they take a lot of time to participate in. But when a university or school is ranked, they immediately celebrate that fact. They begin publishing that information on their materials, on their websites, in their brochures, and in any place that helps leverage the ranking to help them recruit more students or to build their brand. Rankings are most eagerly awaited if they are ranked. That is to say that schools that have never been ranked or programs that have never been ranked, they don't care too much about when the rankings come out unless they're actively trying to become a ranked entity. So unless university rankings methodologies change, there's typically very little movement across the ranking from year to year, at least in terms of rankings that have been published for some time, more than a few years. It's really common for universities to pay close attention to their rank on the list, where they're at, and relative position compared to competitor schools or programs. They closely track this information in the final rankings, and they analyze the subset of data that is published within the rankings. Now, not every piece of data that's collected gets published, but there's a lot of information out there, so schools can end up doing benchmarking and see how they're doing compared to their peer competitor schools. On an earlier slide, I said that university rankings take a considerable amount of time to complete or to participate in. One of the reasons they are so time-consuming is that they collect lots of data from the universities. Publishers themselves don't collect data independently, and they don't measure data independently. They request that information be submitted directly by the university, typically. Here you can see a very high-level summary of the items considered in the Times Higher Education rankings, at least in these categories shown under the graphic. Imagine the breadth and the complexity of a typical university. And then imagine how many people would have to be involved in collecting information as diverse as research and citations compared to international outlook and industry income. Of course, these are just categories and not specific questions, so we need to look more deeply at what is actually being measured. Here we can see a little bit more detail around how these large topics might be broken down into smaller segments and how the overall rating of different subjects relates to the final university rankings. Each ranking publisher has their own methodology and they value different things. But imagine that the rankings data collection process asks tens of questions in each of these major categories, or potentially that there could be many dozens of questions when ranking an entire university. The entire rankings questionnaire itself might have dozens and dozens of questions. In fact, rankings methodologies are a really important area for us to focus on so that we can understand them. Because only by reading and understanding the methodology can we truly realize what a ranking is actually telling people. And that also means that in order for ranking to be appropriately used, it's necessary to understand what it's based on. There will be an exercise in this unit that will help you become familiar with rankings and their methodologies. And lastly, while we're on the topic of methodologies, it's worth noting that rankings are considered a playable game by some in our industry, and this is unfortunate. One of the reasons it contributes to the controversy surrounding rankings. Rankings are not as cut and dry as data collection, data publishing, etc. There have been examples when universities, deans, directors, or analysts have submitted false information to rankings agencies or otherwise tried to game the system in order to positively influence their position within the final rankings. I personally know a former dean that specifically told the school's enrollment group, quote, "Don't be holier than the Pope," when filling out the rankings, or when filling out the rankings questionnaires, the data sets. This is not a direct instruction to violate any of the questions, but rather a message to make the most favorable interpretation of each rankings data question and answer it accordingly. Put your best foot forward. This ultimately and unfortunately is the reason that that person is a former dean. So with rankings, one must take a big grain of salt and understand what you're looking at, what it might be useful for, and where it is definitely not useful.